Okay, so it is noon on a Thursday. The snow is slowly melting, so bringing us joy. Um, Thanks to everyone who has joined us for this brown bag and presentation of the oral portion of a dissertation defense. Um, it is my pleasure to introduce Danielle M. Smith, who is going to be presenting today. So in terms of education, all of Danielle's degrees were earned at the University at Buffalo, yay to us. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Psychology and Sociology, which she earned in 2010. Then an MPH in the Health Behavior concentration from the School of Public Health and Health Professions. That occurred in 2013. And then today in 2021, she will be defending her dissertation, the title of which is Co-occurring Use of Nicotine in Cannabis, Multiple Perspectives on a Complex Phenomenon. And I want to just reach out and introduce her committee members. I'm Lorraine Collins, I serve as chair. Dr. Lynn Kozlowski is on the call, Dr. Richard O'Connor and Dr. Andrew Highland. Rich and Andy are the Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. Just a few words about Danielle's research interests. They are varied and she excels at all of them. So she's interested in biobehavioral aspects of nicotine and cannabis use, cross-product interactions between inhaled forms of nicotine and cannabis, which we'll be hearing about today, vaping devices, a little interest in regulatory science and policy, harm reduction, and cannabis use in the context of cancer prevention, treatment, and symptom management. Danielle is, I just think of her as a very productive worker. She's been employed at Roswell Park Cancer Institute beginning in 2007 as a phone interviewer through today when she's a scientist in the Department of Health Behavior, and did all of her master's and PhD work while employed full time. So again, kudos to Danielle. Without further ado, I turn it over to her. Again, thank you for being here.
Thanks to you, Lorraine. I'm just going to get this screen share set up. All right, can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay. Well, I just want to thank everybody for trying to minimize this. There we go. Okay. Thanks, Lorraine, for that very generous introduction, and thanks everyone so much for being here this afternoon. I'm very excited to share my dissertation work with you, which examined various aspects of co-use of cannabis and nicotine. So I'm just going to get started by going over some information that I think will be relevant for all of the studies covered in today's talk. So we're all familiar with nicotine in cannabis, right? Nicotine is the addictive agent in tobacco products, and this includes products like cigarettes, cigars, and other products. And cannabis is the scientific name for marijuana, which goes by any number of names. You can call it weed, pot, grass, the list goes on. So these are the two most commonly used psychoactive substances in the world, and you'll find the recent prevalence estimates for past month use among adults and youth in the US to the right of the slide. And while these are two very commonly used substances, they have very different effects for public health. Nicotine and tobacco are generally thought to be harmful to health since their use often leads to dependence and addiction. And the use of smoked tobacco has long been recognized as a causal agent in the development of cancer and a number of other illnesses. The science is a lot less clear for cannabis. We know that cannabis might yield therapeutic effects in some circumstances, but we also know that recreational cannabis use presents risk of dependence for about 10% of those who use monthly. And we also know that the use of THC, which is the active agent responsible for the high that comes from cannabis, can present a number of psychosocial risks and exacerbate some mental health issues. But this talks about co-use. So what does that mean? Well, co-use is when we're talking about the use of 2 or more substances by the same person. And in the literature on nicotine and cannabis co-use, we usually break this down into 3 major classifications. The first of which is concurrent use. So when we're talking about concurrent use, we are referring to the use of both products during the same time frame. And this time frame is usually different from study to study. We could be talking about co-use over the lifetime, over the past year, past month, past day. It's just talking about dual use, but there's no specification to how the products are being used together. The second classification is sequential use. So this refers to using a nicotine product immediately after using a cannabis product. So this is a behavior that's often referred to as chasing by cannabis users. And the third is co-administration. So this refers to using both drugs together in the same delivery mechanism. So they're actually mixed together. And the most common example of this would be a blunt, which is a tobacco cigar that has some or all of the tobacco replaced with cannabis. So while the co-use of multiple substances happens with all sorts of drugs, there's a very special relationship between these 2 in particular. It's estimated that 90% of cannabis users will use tobacco at some point over their lifetime. And the groups of people that use tobacco and cannabis overlap quite a bit. So what I have in this diagram here is a depiction of past month concurrent use using data from the 2019 National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And I just want to note quickly that these estimates here I have on the slide are likely to be conservative, since this survey did not start examining the use of e-cigarettes until last year. So really what we're seeing here is that if we look at this universe of tobacco users, we can see that about 1/4 of tobacco users report past month use of cannabis. So there's about 1/4 of the circle there that has that overlap. And if we look at this the other way, looking at this kind of universe of cannabis users, about 50% of cannabis users report use of tobacco products. So there's about half that circle that has some overlap. So before I showed the overall prevalence for nicotine and cannabis use, but most reported prevalence estimates of use aren't calculated for the use of a single substance alone. So what does prevalence look like when we take co-use into account? So these are some older estimates, but they're most recently available from papers done by Jillian Schauer using data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So when we break out exclusive versus co-use, we can actually see that about 5.2% of adults reported co-use in the past month, as did 5.4% of youth. And what's interesting about this is, with all of the attention that cannabis use gets, we can actually see that the rates of co-use exceed those for exclusive cannabis use among adults and among youth. The co-use rates among youth are also higher than those for exclusive tobacco use. We're also seeing that trend analyses over time show that co-use has been increasing among adults, and it remains relatively flat among youth. And we know that those trends are largely being driven by overall increases in cannabis use at the population level. So why does co-use happen? The short answer is there are a lot of reasons, and they range from specific biological and behavioral mechanisms up through some broader scale facilitators. And some of these are related to problematic drug use in general, while others are very specific to the co-use of these 2 substances. So I'm just going to graze over some examples very quickly. Biologically, we know that the endocannabinoid system, which is the major system that cannabis acts on, is involved in addictive behaviors, and this also includes nicotine addiction. We also know that another reason people co-use is that the use of these 2 substances together is thought to boost the high that comes from cannabis. So this is where behaviors like chasing and blunt use really come into play. Both drugs are also most commonly used through inhalation, namely through smoking. And we also see a lot of similarities in the design and marketing for nicotine and cannabis products. And the tobacco industry routinely markets products that are used for cannabis delivery intentionally or otherwise. You can also see a lot of co-use promoted in popular media by celebrities and other artists or other public figures. So here we have my favorite example to use in co-use talks is Snoop Dogg. So for those of you who don't know, he's a hip hop artist and very famous cannabis consumer. He's kind of this exemplar of co-use because he's often depicted smoking blunts, which is a form of co-administration. He also happens to have his own branded line of cannabis vaping products through G-Pen. Another facilitator of co-use, comes down to the industry. We know that tobacco companies are buying up cannabis companies. So the industries are actually becoming one. A notable example of this recently was Altria, which is the parent company of Philip Morris. They make Marlboro cigarettes. They recently purchased a 45% stake in Cronos Group, which is a Canadian cannabis company. And actually just last month, British American Tobacco purchased a 20% stake in Organogram Holdings, which is another cannabis company. So just anecdotally, I was at a Canadian cannabis conference on Tuesday, and this was being discussed because BAT is now also manufacturing cannabis oil pods that are interchangeable with its popular Vuse device that was until very recently sold exclusively for the delivery of nicotine. So what are the health effects of co-use? Well, co-use is important for public health because it tends to lead to worse health outcomes relative to the use of either of these products alone. And this is especially true for those who engage in sequential use and co-administration. Co-users tend to use these substances more often and in greater quantities, which is one qualifier for dependence. So perhaps unsurprisingly, they tend to be at greater risk for developing cannabis and tobacco use disorders. The reinforcing effects that come from co-use create a bit of a trap for users where it becomes very difficult to reduce or quit using either substance. So as such, co-users tend to exhibit lower overall motivation to quit, lower odds of becoming abstinent, greater odds of relapse, and they tend to experience worse short-term withdrawal when they do attempt to quit. Co-users also have higher odds of developing chronic bronchitis and other respiratory problems relative to people that only use tobacco or cannabis alone. So most of the research in this area is primarily bucketed into these descriptive assessments of co-users, or it focuses on how to treat problems that are due to co-use. Most research also focuses on the use of smoked tobacco and cannabis, but as many of you know, we're not just dealing with smoking anymore, right? We have vaping products that have received a lot of attention as of late for nicotine and for cannabis. Cannabis vaping products can also deliver other forms of the drug in addition to the standard dried flower, so they can deliver things like cannabis oils or solid concentrates. So this kind of begs the question, how does this diversification of products available to administer nicotine and cannabis contribute to co-use? Additionally, there is a lot more to co-use than what these larger buckets of research literature are suggesting, right? We have these changing products, we have these changing environmental contexts. So we really need to understand, other things that are just impacting co-use in general. So this is what I set out to do with my dissertation. And the primary goal here was to expand on the existing co-use literature to include more products and dig into what was going on among those who vape these substances. So today I'm just going to be presenting some key findings from 4 studies that serve as examples of what might be accomplished in this area of research. So my dissertation had 4 specific aims. The first was to examine the extent to which nicotine and cannabis use are associated. The second was to describe shared and distinct correlates of use among those who vape nicotine and cannabis. The third was to describe shared and distinct reasons for product use among those who vape nicotine and cannabis. And the fourth is to identify potential health consequences of co-use across a range of smoked and vaped nicotine-containing products. So I approached this examination of co-use by using this conceptual model. So the idea here is that there are a number of use precursors that can contribute to co-use behaviors. And some of these include user characteristics, delivery methods, individual reasons for using nicotine and cannabis products, and these broader environmental factors like policies or social norms. The behaviors are likely to be a function of the substance being used, how often the substance is used, and how much of the substance is used. And these behaviors can contribute to additive health risks like the degree of co-use and exposure to toxicants and carcinogens. So this is going to bring me into study 1, which examined the associations between nicotine and cannabis use, specifically in terms of their modes of delivery, among a sample of youth who participated in an international survey on nicotine and tobacco use. And this study had 2 aims. The first aim was to characterize cannabis and nicotine co-use among youth aged 16 to 19 in 3 countries based on their past month use of different modes of cannabis and nicotine delivery. And the second aim was to assess correlates of co-use and specific modes of cannabis delivery. So this study used data from Wave 1 of the ITC Youth Tobacco and Vaping Survey, which took place in the summer of 2017. The survey was web-based and used a blend of probability and non-probability-based sampling strategies to recruit youth aged 16 to 19 from Canada, England, and the United States. So these are 3 countries with different policies and cultural practices related to nicotine and cannabis use. So you can actually see that here on the bottom of the slide, that from a regulatory perspective, cannabis use was more liberal in Canada and more restrictive in England, while nicotine vaping was more liberal in England and more restrictive in Canada at the time the survey was conducted. So there were just over 12,000 youth who took part in this survey, and the sample sizes were pretty evenly split between each of the 3 countries. The survey took about 15 minutes to complete, and youth were paid for their time in line with the incentive structures for the web panels they participated in. So we used measures of past month use in this project. Among youth who reported past month use of cannabis, we asked follow-up questions about their use of 7 modes of cannabis delivery, which are listed here. And youth were permitted to select any of these 7 modes of cannabis delivery that applied to them, so the choices weren't mutually exclusive. The survey also assessed use of 7 different types of nicotine and tobacco products, which included cigarettes, nicotine-containing e-cigarettes, and other smoked forms of tobacco. And again, youth could respond affirmatively regarding the use of any of these products. For our primary analyses, we derived 4 mutually exclusive classifications to indicate a youth's tobacco use status, which included non-current users of tobacco products, exclusive users of nicotine-containing e-cigarettes, exclusive users of a single combusted tobacco product, and youth who reported using 2 or more nicotine or tobacco products. So we refer to these as poly users. So here we have the prevalence of nicotine and cannabis use in the sample overall and by country. So I just want to note throughout the presentation, I've suppressed confidence intervals to just kind of clarify what we're looking at. And I also want to note that all of the analyses for this study are weighted to reflect the population of youth in each country. So what we saw here is that about 75% of youth in the sample reported no current use of nicotine or cannabis, while about 13% reported use of nicotine products only. 3.8% reported use of cannabis products only, and 8.7% reported co-use of nicotine and cannabis. So again, in this sample, co-use exceeded exclusive cannabis use. We also saw some differences that were significant in the prevalence of each of these products across country. And if we go to looking at kind of this universe of cannabis users in the sample, and we add up each of these percentages for nicotine-containing e-cigarette use, combusted product use, and dual use, this shows that about 70% of youth cannabis users reported using at least one nicotine-containing product. And again, we saw some differences across countries. We saw that more cannabis users in England and Canada reported use of a single combusted tobacco product, and more youth cannabis users in the US reported use of nicotine-containing e-cigarettes and poly tobacco use. And if we move to looking at just the nicotine users in this sample, we can see that approximately 40% reported current use of cannabis. And among these nicotine users, prevalence of cannabis use was highest in Canada, followed by the United States, and then England. So here we have the distribution of self-reported use of 7 modes of cannabis delivery according to nicotine use status. So what we have here are non-tobacco users shown in blue, exclusive nicotine e-cigarette users shown in yellow, exclusive users of a single combusted tobacco product in green, and dual and poly users in gray. And what we can see here is that cannabis smoked without tobacco was the most prevalent mode of use overall, despite the use of nicotine. We saw that cannabis mixed with tobacco in a joint or blunt was more prevalent among youth who reported using a single combusted tobacco product or who reported dual or poly tobacco use. And use of a bong or water pipe to deliver cannabis was highest among poly tobacco users. The use of vaping products to deliver cannabis actually showed an interesting pattern, with more youth who reported exclusive nicotine e-cigarette use and poly tobacco users reporting cannabis vaping. And this pattern was really most evident among youth who reported using e-cigarettes to administer cannabis oils or e-liquids. Edible use was more frequently reported among youth who didn't use nicotine-containing products and among poly users. And the use of cannabis concentrates and extracts was highest among youth who reported poly tobacco use. Now, I do want to note that we modeled these associations using logistic regression to account for other factors. I'm not going to show those just in the interest of time, but I will note that after adjustment, We saw that dual and poly tobacco users had significantly higher odds of using all of these modes of delivery compared to non-nicotine users. And we also saw that the odds of smoking cannabis with tobacco were significantly higher among youth who used smoked tobacco products, while the odds of using cannabis oils and e-cigarettes were about 5-fold higher among youth who used nicotine-containing e-cigarettes. We also saw some interesting patterns emerge by country, specifically with England, which is represented by the green bars on this slide. Canada is represented by the blue bars, while the US is represented by the yellow bars. So we can see some differences in the way cannabis is smoked between countries, with greater prevalence of using smoked cannabis without tobacco and using cannabis in a bong or water pipe among youth in Canada and the United States. Use of cannabis mixed with tobacco was much more prevalent, as you can see here, among youth in England relative to youth in the North American countries. And this kind of makes sense when you think about what the cultural practices are like for cannabis in the UK, right? Cannabis is almost always used mixed with tobacco throughout the UK and most of Western Europe. Similarly, cannabis vaping was highest among youth in the United States relative to other countries. And we saw that use of edibles was relatively similar across each country, while the use of extracts was lower in England relative to Canada and the United States. And again, when we modeled these findings, accounting for demographic and other substance use factors, we saw that youth in England had significantly lower odds of using all forms of cannabis relative to youth in the United States, except for smoking cannabis with tobacco. So in that case, youth in England had over 10 times higher odds of using cannabis that way relative to youth in the United States. Okay, so for this table and throughout the rest of the talk, any numbers in red will indicate statistically significant findings. And what we're looking at here are the results of logistic regression models examining correlates of co-use relative to exclusive nicotine use and exclusive cannabis use. So really what we did here in column 1 was we looked at all of the youth who used nicotine in this sample, and we compared those who didn't use cannabis to those who did. And we did the same for cannabis over here in column 2. So we looked at all of the cannabis users in the sample, and we compared cannabis users who did not use nicotine to those that did. So if we go back to this first column, we can see that co-users had 68% greater odds of living in Canada compared to the United States, and had nearly 3-fold higher odds of reporting a history of alcohol use. The odds of being a co-user tended to decrease as harm perceptions of smoked cannabis increased. We also saw differences according to use of nicotine-containing products, with youth who only used e-cigarettes having lower odds of co-use, and poly tobacco users having nearly 2-fold higher odds of being a co-user compared to youth who only used a single combusted tobacco product. So if we move over to the second column, where we compare differences between co-users and exclusive cannabis users, we can see that co-users had 49% higher odds of being white rather than non-white, and 68% higher odds of living in England relative to the United States. We use the number of electronic devices in the household as an indicator of household income in this study. And this showed that the odds of being a co-user decreased as the number of devices in the household increased. Co-use also tended to increase by 10% with each additional point of self-rated depression on a 1 to 7 scale. So in this first study, we saw that most youth who used cannabis also largely used nicotine-containing products, and youth cannabis use spanned a wide array of different delivery methods. The patterns in cannabis delivery methods emerged according to country of residence and the types of nicotine products that youth used. So as we saw in England, cannabis and tobacco mixed together in one delivery method was much more prevalent, while there was more diverse forms of use occurring in the North American countries. Youth who tended to smoke combusted tobacco products also tended to smoke cannabis, while youth who vaped nicotine also tended to vape cannabis. Youth co-users also exhibited different characteristics compared to exclusive users of these substances. But as I mentioned before, co-use means many things. It's not really about whether people are using both substances together, but it's also about how these substances are being used together, right? So this brings me to study 2, where we switch gears a bit to look at a sample of adults who co-used vape nicotine and cannabis, and how they used inhaled modes of delivery for these substances. So the study had 3 aims. The first aim was to examine demographic and psychological characteristics of individuals who concurrently vape nicotine and cannabis. The second aim was to examine the association between concurrent use patterns by mode of use and substance. And the third aim was to examine associations between sequential use and co-administration by mode of use and substance. So for this study, we conducted a cross-sectional anonymous survey of adults aged 18 to 65 who lived in areas with medically or recreationally legal cannabis policies in place. We targeted adults who reported at least monthly concurrent use of vape, nicotine, and cannabis, which could include people who did or did not also smoke these substances. Participants were recruited using Amazon Mechanical Turk over the summer and were invited to take part in a short screener survey to assess their eligibility for the main study. Folks who were eligible proceeded to take part in the main survey, which lasted about 25 to 30 minutes on average. And those who completed were paid a total of $5 for their time. So I want to note that we screened about 2,200 individuals on MTurk, and about 5.6% of them were eligible. So this was a very small target population. But among those who were eligible, over 80% completed the survey and 76% provided usable data, which left us with a final sample size of 112 people. So for the main study, everyone answered questions on demographics. We also used an adapted timeline follow-back measure to assess patterns of product use on a typical use week, which included the number of days used, the number of times the product was used within a day, and the number of puffs taken on products during a typical use session. We used those data to calculate measures of monthly frequency and heaviness of use. And we also asked questions from previously published studies about how often participants engaged in 4 forms of sequential use and 4 forms of co-administered use. Finally, we included a set of validated psychological measures from the Global Appraisal of Individual Needs Short Screener, so that's GAIN-SS abbreviated, to examine the degree of individuals' internalizing behaviors, externalizing behaviors, and substance use problems that might require clinical intervention. So here are the characteristics of the sample. Although most of the sample was under age 30, there was a sizable number of adults over age 30 in the sample, about 40%. Most identified as male and as being white, and most lived in an area where adult use cannabis was permitted. The income distribution was relatively evenly distributed across the sample, and over 80% of the sample reported having at least some college education. So here we have the findings examining the psychological characteristics of those who co-used vaped nicotine and cannabis. So a quick note about the GAIN, the subscales get classified into 4 categories, which represent no need for clinical intervention, or a low, moderate, or high degree of problems that might require clinical intervention. So as you can see here, everyone in this sample scored as having moderate or high degrees of each of these problems that might require clinical intervention. And just to note about internalizing behaviors, you can think about these as problematic energy that's directed toward oneself. So think of things like depression. Externalizing behaviors reflect problematic energy that's directed at others. So you can think about things like physical or relational aggression in these cases. And what we found in this sample is that most participants exhibited a high degree of internalizing behavior, a moderate degree of externalizing behavior, and a moderate degree of substance use problems. So here we have an overview of the use of other substances and products used by those who co-used vaped nicotine and cannabis. And you can see here that most reported past month use of alcohol, and on average reported the use of multiple forms of nicotine and cannabis use other than vaped methods. So we had about 3 modes of cannabis delivery being used on average and 2 modes of nicotine delivery being used on average among the sample. We also saw some negligible use of other drugs, which included the use of things like opiates, stimulants, hallucinogens, and club drugs. So when we looked at their use of smoked cannabis and tobacco, importantly, 100% of the sample also reported smoking cannabis with some regularity, while over half reported using tobacco cigarettes. So I thought it was kind of interesting that while these folks vaped nicotine and cannabis with some regularity, they also largely smoked cannabis and tobacco too. So these graphs here are showing comparisons for patterns of concurrent use. Specifically, we're looking at frequency of quantity of uses reflected by 4 measures. So up here we have the number of days used per month, the number of use sessions per month, the number of hits taken per use session, and a measure of monthly quantity and frequency of use. So this is a combined measure that reflects use heaviness. So for these, we chose to present how cannabis vaping compared to cannabis smoking and how cannabis vaping compared to nicotine vaping on these measures. And all of these comparisons were done using paired t-tests. So what we found was that there was a small but statistically significant difference in the average number of days per month that participants reported cannabis vaping compared to cannabis smoking, while the number of days they spent vaping nicotine was not statistically different from the days they spent vaping cannabis. We didn't see any significant differences between the number of hits taken on products, but where we did start to see some more significant differences was with the measures of the number of times people reported picking up each of these products in a given month, right? So we saw a small but statistically significant difference between cannabis smoking and cannabis vaping, with participants reporting slightly more use sessions for cannabis vaping on average. Nicotine vaping products were used much more frequently each month compared to cannabis vaping products. And when we examined this in terms of how heavily the products were actually being used, we saw that there were really no significant differences between the heaviness of use for cannabis smoking and for cannabis vaping, while nicotine vaping products on average were used much more heavily compared to cannabis vaping products. So here I have results from 5 logistic regression models looking at the odds of engaging in sequential use behaviors according to the average number of days inhaled forms of nicotine and cannabis were used each month. So in other words, this is looking at how often people use nicotine right after using cannabis. And these estimates were adjusted for age, sex, and psychological subscale scores. And what we found is that as each additional day of cigarette smoking per month increased, the odds of frequently chasing cannabis smoking with cigarette smoking increased by about 13%. And we also saw a similar finding when looking at chasing cannabis vaping with cigarette smoking, where the odds increased by about 10%. And as the number of nicotine vaping days per month increased, the odds of frequently chasing cannabis vaping with nicotine vaping and the odds of chasing cannabis smoking with nicotine vaping also increased. So you can see that by about 8% and 11% respectively. So the bottom line with these findings is that total monthly nicotine use was significantly and positively associated with more frequent engagement in what are ultimately cannabis use behaviors. So here we have a similar set of analyses looking at the odds of co-administration and total monthly use of cigarettes, vaped cannabis, smoked cannabis, and vaped nicotine. And you'll see a little bit less is happening here. So frequent use of nicotine and cannabis oils in e-cigarettes tended to increase slightly as the number of cigarette smoking days per month increased. And frequently mixing tobacco and cannabis together in a joint or blunt and smoking cigarettes dipped in hash oil tended to increase, along with the number of days that participants used smoked cannabis each month. So what the takeaway here is that co-administration behaviors were really more closely related to level of monthly smoking. So for study 2, we found that those who regularly vape nicotine and cannabis tend to exhibit moderate to high mental health and substance use problems and regularly engage in some form of smoking. We also saw that different co-use practices show different associations with use patterns and inhaled modes of delivery. Monthly concurrent use patterns were more closely related by substance rather than mode of use. Sequential use or chasing was related to greater overall use of nicotine-containing products each month. And finally, co-administration behaviors, including things like blunt use, were significantly associated with level of monthly smoking. So we have a lot happening with which products are being used and how they're being used, but why are they being used? So this is the focus of study 3, which looks at the reasons people use vaped nicotine and cannabis individually and why they co-used nicotine and cannabis, how these reasons are similar or different to one another, and their associations with product use. So in this study, we had 3 aims. The first aim was to examine the most prevalent reasons for using and co-using inhaled nicotine and cannabis products. The second aim was to assess similarities and differences between reasons for using vaped nicotine versus vaped cannabis and vaped cannabis versus smoked cannabis. And the third aim was to examine the association between reasons for use and product use behaviors. So for this study, we used the same data from the MTurk survey that recruited 112 co-users of vaped nicotine and cannabis. And in this survey, all participants responded to parallel sets of 15 measures to assess reasons for using vaped cannabis, vaped nicotine, and smoked cannabis. So for these measures, the phrasing was slightly adjusted for each set to accommodate differences by substance and by product. And the items that we used were selected from studies in the published literature, as well as validated measures from national level studies. So 15 items is a lot of measures. So what we did is we, myself and another individual rater thematically grouped these into 4 general classifications. And these ended up being reasons for use related to the user experience, the product or substance, product utility, and harm reduction. And I'm just going to go over what those mean in a few minutes. We also administered an adapted measure of reasons for co-use developed by Carla Berg, which consisted of 11 items that represented 4 dimensions of co-use. So these were instrumentality, displacement, social context, and experimentation. And again, I'll talk about what those mean specifically in a minute. So here we have a summary of the average ratings for using nicotine vaping products, cannabis vaping products, and smoked cannabis. So what we're seeing here is that higher scores mean a person more strongly endorsed each of these reasons for use. And again, we're comparing average ratings for cannabis smoking to cannabis vaping and for nicotine vaping to cannabis vaping using paired t-tests. So what we found here was that cannabis vaping was rated significantly higher than nicotine vaping on reasons related to the user experience. So this included things like subjective feelings of feeling buzzed or high. Cannabis vaping was also rated significantly higher than nicotine vaping on reasons related to the product or the substance. So this included items related to taste or for price. We didn't see any significant differences between nicotine and cannabis vaping in terms of product utility. However, cannabis vaping was rated higher on measures of utility than cannabis smoking. So when we're thinking utility, this included measures of purposeful use. So this includes things like using vaping products to circumvent smoke-free policies. Nicotine vaping was also rated higher on measures of harm reduction compared to cannabis vaping, while there were no significant differences in harm reduction related reasons for use between cannabis vaping and cannabis smoking. So the harm reduction related measures really included items that assessed using products to reduce health issues for oneself or for others. So here we have the average ratings for the reasons for nicotine and cannabis co-use. And we can see here that ratings were highest for reasons related to social context, which involved using these substances in different settings or with different people. Ratings for instrumentality, which involves co-using the substances to achieve a better high, and reasons for use related to experimentation were rated equivalently, while reasons for displacement, which really involves product substitution between nicotine and cannabis, were rated lowest overall. So when we looked at the way reasons for use were associated with overall monthly use sessions for vaped nicotine, vaped cannabis, and smoked cannabis and co-use behaviors, we found some interesting patterns. So I'm sorry in advance for this very busy table, but I'll walk you through it. So after we controlled for the use of other substances and demographic and psychological variables, finding from linear regression models showed that higher ratings for utility-related reasons for use and higher ratings for harm reduction-related reasons for use were positively associated with more monthly nicotine vaping. We also saw that higher ratings for utility-related reasons for cannabis smoking were associated with lower overall levels of monthly nicotine vaping. Higher product or substance-related reasons for cannabis smoking were associated with higher overall levels of cannabis smoking per month. We also saw that higher ratings for the user experience related reasons for cannabis vaping and utility-related reasons for cannabis smoking were associated with greater odds of ever engaging in chasing behaviors. And when we looked at monthly product use according to reasons for co-use, we saw that higher ratings for instrumentality-related reasons for co-use were positively associated with more monthly nicotine vaping sessions. And these were also associated with a 3-fold higher odds of ever engaging in chasing behaviors. We also saw that as the levels of endorsement for experimentation-related reasons for co-use increased, the odds of ever engaging in chasing behaviors decreased. So for study 3, the most highly endorsed reason for using vaping products was utility, while reasons for co-use were rated most highly for social context. So taking these findings together, we also concluded that vaping products serve purposes to users that differ by substance. People that vape nicotine seem to do so to avoid harms to health, but people who vape cannabis do it because it provides certain practical advantages over smoking it. This also underscores the importance of understanding what harm perceptions are for each substance, because that is likely influencing this particular takeaway. We also saw that lifetime sequential use practices and more frequent monthly nicotine vaping were associated with greater endorsement of co-using nicotine and cannabis to achieve a better high. So this is going to bring me to the last study in my dissertation, which provides an example of what these behaviors may translate to in terms of possible health effects. So in this study, we had two aims. The first aim was to describe concentrations for biomarkers of exposure among concurrent users of tobacco and cannabis across a broad spectrum of tobacco products. And the second aim was to compare differences in biomarker concentrations between co-users and tobacco-only users. So in this project, we used data from the Population Assessment of Tobacco and Health Study Biomarker Restricted Use Files. So quick background, PATH is a national longitudinal cohort study of adults and youth in the United States that examines the effects of tobacco use on health outcomes, and it includes biological assessments of tobacco exposure. So our sample included 5,859 adults aged 18 or older that used a wide array of different tobacco products. And we had a sample of non-users of tobacco products, users of a single tobacco product, which included those who use just cigarettes, just nicotine-containing e-cigarettes, just cigars, and just hookah. And we also looked at dual users of tobacco cigarettes and e-cigarettes as our kind of example of polytobacco use, since this is the most common polytobacco use pattern in the US. So these adults provided urine samples that were analyzed for over 50 biomarkers of exposure to nicotine, tobacco-specific nitrosamines, heavy metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and volatile organic compounds using mass spec methods. So for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on 6 representative biomarkers from 4 major chemical classes. So for nicotine, we use total nicotine equivalence 2, abbreviated TNE2, as our marker of exposure to nicotine, while for tobacco-specific nitrosamine NNK, we use the biomarker NNAL to indicate exposure to that toxicant. So just quickly, tobacco-specific nitrosamines, these are cancer-causing agents that are only present in tobacco smoke, nicotine only present in tobacco. We also examined biomarkers of exposure to 2 polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and 2 volatile organic compounds. So these toxicants are not specific to tobacco, and they might be found in other kinds of smoke, including cannabis smoke. Many of these biomarkers reflect possible exposure to systemic toxicants and carcinogens, and they're classified as harmful or potentially harmful constituents in tobacco products by the US FDA. So here we have the prevalence of cannabis use among each tobacco group in the sample, and cannabis use is shown with the green portions of these bars. And I'll note once again that the estimates here are weighted to be reflective of the US non-institutionalized populations of these groups under study. And you can see here that cannabis use was lowest among those who did not use tobacco products, while use was higher among all tobacco users, ranging from 13.2% of dual users of cigarettes and e-cigarettes to 23.1% of hookah users. So here we have the geometric mean biomarker concentrations among non-users of tobacco products. So on these slides, the light gray bars depict non-cannabis users and the gray bars depict cannabis users. The error bars are actually depicting the 95% confidence interval for the geometric mean. And any numbers that are bold with a star indicate a statistically significant difference in concentrations between cannabis users and non-cannabis users. So overall, what we saw here is that the concentrations of each of these biomarkers were similar between those who did and did not use cannabis. The exception to this was the biomarker for acrylonitrile, which is up here in panel C. So acrylonitrile is a probable human carcinogen. And we saw that the concentrations of acrylonitrile were significantly higher among cannabis users relative to non-cannabis users. So I know this is a little busy, I'm sorry for that, but what we're seeing here are the concentrations of biomarkers of exposure to non-tobacco specific smoke byproducts among users of a single tobacco product. So again, we have light gray bars indicating those who didn't use cannabis, dark gray bars indicating those who did use cannabis, and the products that we're looking at here are exclusive e-cigarette users, exclusive cigarette users, exclusive users of cigars, and exclusive users of hookah. So in general, we saw significantly higher concentrations of many general smoke-related biomarkers across users of all of these products. The differences were really most consistent for volatile organic compounds, acrylonitrile and acrylamide, which are represented in panels C and panel D. The percentage differences between each of these was pretty stark, even though the absolute values might not necessarily appear that way. So just as one example, if you go to panel C looking at e-cigarette users, this was actually a 459% difference in the concentration for acrylonitrile between e-cigarette users who reported using cannabis versus those who didn't. So when we looked at to see whether there were differences in biomarkers that are specific to tobacco exposure, including TNE2 and NNAL, we didn't see any statistically significant differences in exposure to nicotine or to tobacco-specific nitrosamine NNK. So what this is really suggesting is that differences in the smoke biomarkers are driven by another source of smoke exposure other than tobacco. Finally, what we have here are the concentrations of each of these biomarkers among dual users of tobacco cigarettes and e-cigarettes. And again, you'll notice that the concentrations of general smoke exposure biomarkers are significantly higher among cannabis users compared to those who did not use cannabis. And again, the concentrations of tobacco-specific biomarkers were not statistically different between cannabis users and non-users. So to wrap up study 4, we found that co-users exhibited significantly higher concentrations of biomarkers of exposure to many combustion byproducts, but showed few to no statistical differences in the concentrations of tobacco-specific biomarkers. So what does this mean? Well, it means that it's pretty likely the exposures are due to cannabis smoking. Something else that wasn't a primary aim of this project, but is an important takeaway, is that tobacco researchers really need to measure cannabis use in order to avoid confounded exposure estimates. And this is particularly important now when there's so much public discussion on figuring out what the exposures and health effects of e-cigarette use are. Not controlling or accommodating cannabis use will likely overestimate biomarker concentrations among e-cigarette users. And this is also just important to do in general when we're considering there are high rates of co-use occurring among tobacco users, and there's increasing cannabis legalization, which may further contribute to this. Okay, so when we take all of these findings together, what does all of this contribute to our understanding of nicotine and cannabis co-use? Well, from study 1, we saw that it will be important to consider associations between modes of cannabis and nicotine use and specific types of co-use in the context of culture and policy, since these are related to co-use behaviors. Study 2 showed us that co-use involves cross-product use of smoked and vape substances, and this can get pretty complex. So it's important to consider how co-use is operationalized and which specific behaviors we may want to look at for certain outcomes of interest. Study 3 showed us that the reasons people use vaping products and the reasons they co-use nicotine and cannabis are associated with their overall monthly consumption of these substances. And finally, study 4 showed us that co-users are likely subject to greater exposure to smoke constituents that are linked to the development of chronic diseases later in life. Something else that study 4 really hit on, but I would argue is also true across all of these studies, is that it's important to look at these two substances together when you're doing science, right? It can lead to more realistic assessments of our outcomes that are in line with the way people are actually using substances in the real world. So overall, this dissertation had a number of strengths and limitations. As far as strengths go, we utilized data that spanned multiple populations and contexts. So we had this real diversity of information to work with. And in studies 2 and 3 in particular, we had novel measures of cannabis use that really aren't available in most other data sets. In study 4, we also had a nationally representative sample that had biological measures of tobacco use included. And overall, the dissertation considered more than just smoke products, so it contributed something above and beyond our understanding to the existing literature, which mostly focuses on smoking. However, as limitations go, these were 4 cross-sectional studies, so we can't determine anything as far as causality is concerned. We also had limited measures of cannabis use in studies 1 and 4, and a small sample size that was generated using a convenient sampling method in studies 2 and 3. So in these cases, we have some issues with limited generalizability and also some limitations in the analytic approaches we could have taken to analyzing particularly the data for studies 2 and 3. So where to go from here? Well, the findings from this dissertation can really go in any number of directions. I would say these data could easily inform studies that examine similar research questions using other designs and measures. Longitudinal within-person assessments will certainly be quite useful. Ecological momentary assessments, so really looking at that real-time momentary unfolding of behavior, I think would be really useful in this area. And doing other exposure studies, I think will also add a lot to this topic area. Studies of co-use should also be conducted among different demographic groups and people that reside in different cultural and policy environments. So especially with vaping, we're seeing a lot being done on youth and young adults. And while it's certainly important work, this dissertation suggests that it makes sense to expand this topic to other groups. Finally, I think it's really important to acknowledge what studying co-use can contribute to the bigger picture in studying nicotine alone or cannabis alone. So in each of these areas, we're seeing a lot of changes happening in use trends and in use behaviors. And if you're studying co-use, you can actually help shed light on some mechanisms or things that might be driving some of what's going on in these areas that you wouldn't otherwise find from looking at just nicotine use alone or just cannabis use alone. So with that, I'd like to offer my acknowledgement thanks to several individuals who worked with me throughout this dissertation. Dissertations are a lot of individual work, but it really doesn't happen without the input and support of your community, right? So first and foremost, I'd like to thank my committee for investing their time in my education and for putting up with me. So thanks very much to all four of you. And I'd like to thank Lorraine, especially, who's been a great source of support throughout this process. I'd also like to thank Lynn for contributing his tobacco knowledge and expertise to the MTurk survey that was deployed. I'd also like to thank Andy Highland for inspiring me to get into this line of work to begin with. You took a chance on me about 15 years ago and it led me here. So thank you very much. And I want to thank Rich O'Connor because he always seems to have the answers. So thank you, Rich, for being very wise. I'd also like to thank the team in the Department of Health Behavior at Roswell Park, specifically Mashe Ganovich and Connor Miller for their contributions to some of the projects I presented here, as well as thanks to some of my external collaborators for their contributions and assistance. That was really helpful in moving all of this work forward. And lastly, I would like to thank all of you for taking time out to join me this afternoon. So at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
So thank you, Danielle. It's probably useful if you stop sharing your screen. Yeah, so then folks can, and a lot of people have their video off. Please join us having your video on. And if you want to ask a question, just unmute. I think, Danielle, you also have access to the chat, right?
I do.
Yeah.
Let's look at it. Okay.
Yeah, so folks can also put questions into the chat, but it's open to all of us. Any questions, comments?
So I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a comment, Danielle. I thought that was a really great presentation, a great body of work you've done through the years. And my thanks to your committee for all of their efforts working with you. So nice job. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Hi, Danielle. This is Monty Travers. Great job, and so much work and just so much effort clearly went into all the studies you just presented, and just really nice work. My question is, how would you take the, with cannabis being legalized in New York State and the changes that we're going to see, what kind of messaging or communication do you think would be useful, especially considering the work that you just presented and your findings? I think, this is going to be a complicated message to tobacco users, to vapors, to everybody. And I'm just wondering how you would take your findings and translate them into a communication message.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think that's going to be a very important point. So with tobacco users, I think the one thing that comes to mind is, the quit line, right? So that's a state-run entity, and we should really be kind of focusing on, these sorts of communications and messaging strategies to target problematic or high-level cannabis use among tobacco users, because the facilitation and reinforcement aspects that come into greater problems in quitting and things like that tend to occur at higher levels of use. And these more like synergistic use patterns, so things like sequential use, things like co-administration, those are really problematic behaviors. So I would say, we should be telling tobacco users to avoid doing that, kind of in general. And that would be true for people smoking conventional cigarettes and also for vapors. Something else interesting that popped into my head as you were talking. So I visited when we were in SRNT in San Francisco a number of years ago. I actually went to a dispensary, and they had cards in the dispensary that actually talked about this. Don't use your cannabis alongside tobacco. Don't use it combined with alcohol. So there were these kind of, it was self-help material really, but they had this stuff advertised, and I thought that was really interesting and a good move on the part of California. So that's something that, New York State might want to consider as they're opening, particularly some of these consumption lounges that are going to be popping up all over the place in the next few years.
Hey, Danielle, it's Nick. Great job. I was interested when you were talking about like sessions per month and puffs per session. Because as we've seen with tobacco, a cigarette's a pretty discrete thing that's easy to define, and e-cig use behavior is a lot harder to define. Some people may have these sessions, some may use perpetually throughout the day. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that with marijuana use or cannabis use versus cannabis vaping, and do people really have vaping sessions, or are they just kind of vaping continuously throughout the day?
So I think that's really interesting. So cannabis vaping, I don't think is used in the same way. Like you study vapors, right? That there's the people that pick it up out of their pocket every couple of seconds. They take a few puffs, they put it away. And then there's the people, like we've got truck drivers, that are just puffing on the thing all day as they're driving across the country. Cannabis is a fundamentally different substance. So I think that is really the influencing factor here. There's only so much cannabis that can be taken in by a user before it starts to become too much. There's like kind of, they hit a ceiling of how much that they can really take in. So, they might have like a session in the sense that they pull it out, they have a few puffs, and that's that. It seems to be more similar to the way that cannabis is smoked. So I would say in that way they're more similar, but nicotine, yeah, is, like you said, it's an entirely different beast.
So Danielle, fabulous presentation. I continue to learn from you all the time. I did have a message about the whole co-use from a public health perspective, and that has to do with the role of the dose of THC. Because unlike nicotine, where we can mainly count on a certain dosage in a cigarette, some of these cannabis products vary quite a bit in terms of potency of THC. So can you talk about that a little bit?
So talk about it in general or in terms of co-use?
In terms of co-use and public health messages.
Yeah, so we know that problematic cannabis use has a direct relationship with product potency, right? So if you're using more potent products, that's going to tend to lead to cannabis problems. So I guess this also kind of relates to something that Manzi was touching on earlier. You really want to kind of avoid pushing these potent products on people who are using nicotine and tobacco. Since, in these cannabis vape pens, I think would be a great example. A lot of these products have excess of 85% or higher THC within the vape cartridges, which, can be pretty potent. So yeah, I would just say that would be something that we would want to kind of consider from a public health perspective and monitor moving forward how these more potent formulations are being used, and then try and kind of find ways to discourage tobacco and nicotine users from taking those up.
So just a quick follow-up. At the start, you mentioned how big tobacco is purchasing cannabis companies. Do you see that as kind of a risk from a public health perspective? Because aren't they going to want people to use their cannabis and their tobacco products?
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, British American Tobacco is already doing it. So yeah, that was, and I was so lucky, I was so fortunate. I was at the Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids conference. You have to say that slow because it can get confusing. But that was presented there that, you know, the Views device, right? This is an e-cigarette, but now BAT, they've purchased this holding in a cannabis company, and now they're making pods that are interchangeable with the exact same device. And that's, I mean, I would say that's a pretty direct facilitator of co-use if there wasn't, you know, among other things that are going on. So yeah, I think that's something that we should continue to keep an eye on kind of collectively as a public health community.
If there's time, a quick question. Great job, Danielle, and you've really exceeded expectations on this project, and just wonderful work. Is there any evidence in your literature review of an association between trauma, past trauma, adverse childhood experiences, or whatever, and dual use, or any of these interactions of these patterns?
So for co-use specifically, I have not seen an article that gets into adverse childhood experiences, although we know that co-users tend to exhibit more like problems overall, right? So they tend to exhibit, you know, even personality disorders. There's like, there's a small literature on that, mental health issues like depression, anxiety, things like that. So we know that a lot of those factors can be attributable to adverse childhood experiences. So I would bet that there is an association, but as far as somebody who's looked at it empirically, I'm not aware that that's happened yet.
Okay.
Okay, well, it's 1 o'clock. Again, I want to thank Danielle for an excellent presentation. I want to thank everyone who attended. We had quite a nice turnout, and so I appreciate the time all of you put into listening and asking questions. And on that note, we can say goodbye. So thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Awesome job, Danielle.
Oh, thanks, Connor.
Really like the slides in particular at the beginning.
I thought they were very good slides as well.
You did a great job. It was great.
Thank you. Lorraine, do we have to go to another room?
We do, and I was going to suggest that the committee take like a 5-minute break.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah, just, you know, so why don't we regroup at like 1:10 or so?
Okay, sounds great. Thanks.
Yep, bye.